1961. Before Gagarin's triumph, voices whispered from orbit, and then were lost. In the early 1960s, the world learned to listen upward. Nations traded artillery salvos for trajectories. Prestige was measured in apogees and burn times. In kitchens and schoolyards, the names of Sputnik and Luna were recited like saints, while engineers in Baikonur and Cape Canaveral drew circles on blackboards that promised escape from gravity. The newspapers printed flames and smoke. The radios carried static and countdowns. Across a divided Europe, amateur operators turned their dials and craned toward rooftops, chasing ghosts in the shortwave night. Official history would later fix a simple truth. Yuri Gagarin, April 12, 1961, the first human to orbit. But before the posters and parades, there were rumors that felt heavier than gossip. In a disused bunker outside Turin, two brothers, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, rebuilt wartime gear into a listening station. They mapped frequencies rumored to carry Soviet telemetry, strung aerials across cracked concrete, set their tape reels turning, and waited through long Italian nights while the stars arced like metronomes over the Alps. What they believed they could did not sound like triumph. It sounded like struggle. Between rhythmic beeps of guidance channels and the plaintive sweep of a biosignal, a voice surfaced, hurried, breathy, its consonants bitten short by distance. On a different night, another fragment rose, faint and human, a gasp, a phrase in Russian that no machine could form. The brothers logged times, bearings, and signal strength with the neatness of accountants. Their entries read like prayers. 1921, UTC, voice present. 1926, fading. 1929, silence. In cafes, they spoke quietly of what the tapes implied, that before Gagarin there had been someone, perhaps several someones, up there already, circling above an Earth that did not yet know their names. The idea spread through the small republic of listeners faster than any official communique. Whether error, hoax, or truth, the reels in Turin had captured a new possibility. The first human sounds from orbit might not have been cheers or anthems, but the raw breath of survival. In early 1960, the Turin station logged a signal unlike any they had tracked before. A slow, steady pulse, layered with telemetry tones, then a man's breath, ragged but rhythmic, as if counted by a metronome that drifted out of tune. A faint voice cut through, unintelligible syllables shaped by a mouth too far from the Earth to be comforted. The tape reel turned until the pulse thinned and vanished. On the log, the brothers wrote two words in capital letters: possible human. More fragments followed. A Morse transmission, botched but disciplined, rode a carrier that wandered across the band like a tired swimmer crossing a river. A week later, a woman's voice arrived, clipped by static. "Do you hear me? The heat rises. I'm waiting for instructions." She spoke like a pilot reciting a checklist against panic, the vowels crushed into the grit of ionized air. The voice returned, weaker. "I will re-enter soon." Then the line went dead. On the bunker's concrete wall, someone sketched an orbit by hand, marking a small cross where the signal had faded, as if a star had been blown out. Word of the tapes leaked. A local journalist printed a cautious column. A national paper ran a headline with the appetite of a bonfire. The brothers demonstrated their antenna arrays, explained Doppler shifts with chalk, and played the reels for reporters who did not breathe while the woman spoke. Letters arrived from Germany, England, Spain, from men and women who swore that, on certain nights, their own receivers had opened like windows onto an altitude where only machines were meant to speak. A few were hoaxes, a few were misheard satellites, but some were recordings the brothers had not made, aligned to the same hours and path. Each arrived like another knock on a locked door. Moscow's posture was orthodoxy carved in granite. Pravda called the Turin brothers charlatans and their supporters dupes of Western propaganda. Spokesmen presented timelines as unbroken hymns: Sputnik, Luna, Vostok, the sequence pure and victorious, the record unmarred by failure. If animals died, they died as heroes. If rockets fell, they fell uncrewed. And if voices were heard in foreign basements, those voices were tricks of atmosphere, misaligned coils, tropospheric ducting, wishful thinking polished into belief. Inside the Soviet program, secrecy was a second fuel. Launch manifests were compartmentalized, telemetry frequencies shifted, accidents were digested behind fences. A cosmonaut's public image was sculpture. Youth, health, certainty. The state could not afford a chorus of ghosts. Better to deny the very possibility of a song. In Washington and London, the reaction was quieter and more conditional. Intelligence analysts filed the reels as anomalous, worth retention. Some suspected balloon tests at stratospheric altitudes. Others posited high-G ejection trials, whose telemetry had ridden the ionosphere farther than intended. A minority, reading the logs against the known launch schedule, marked several nights with asterisks and wrote simply, "unaccounted." Memos crossed desks with the steady, unemotional cadence that bureaucracies use when speaking near a rumor they cannot touch. Publicly, the world preferred a cleaner story. Gagarin's smile was narrative you could stamp on a postage and hang in classrooms. School children drew Vostok as a tidy sphere with a brave man inside. Parades needed banners, not footnotes. Yet in the small republic of listeners, the after-hours debates lengthened. Were the brothers hearing fiction? Were they being used? Or had the space age begun, as so many ages do, with losses hidden to preserve momentum? The bunker turned quieter after midnight. The reels clicked, reversed, clicked again. Every hiss seemed meaningful. Every silence sounded like a secret held too long. Outside, the Alps wore stars like frost, and the antennae kept their vigil. They would later nickname her, because names make grief bearable. The tape the brothers dated to late spring 1961 begins with telemetry tones wobbling as if heat were bending the carrier. Over them, a woman's voice emerges, calm at first, the consonants precise, the cadence of a checklist. She reports temperature, cabin pressure, the status of straps. Then the rhythm phrase, "Do you hear me? It is hot. I feel heat on the outside. I will re-enter soon. Tell my family." The last phrase breaks into a breath like someone running indoors from winter cold. No archive in Moscow admits her. No mission ledger lists a female flight before Tereshkova. Engineers scoff that cockpit microphones in test craft were never routed to open space. Linguists have argued over the phrasing on the reel, over vowel color and dialect, some declaring it studio trickery, others that only a trained pilot could compress fear into such clipped reports. The brothers, for their part, simply point to Doppler traces that match an object falling, and to a carrier that gutters exactly where a radio should when ionization builds around a capsule knifing into air. The fragment ends abruptly. No scream, no epilogue, only the thin freight train rush of plasma and then silence that feels physical, like a door slammed in another room. In the bunker, the reel ticks to its clear tail and spins. Someone turns on a desk fan, though the night is cold. For a long minute, none of the men present will look at each other. It is easier to address the equipment, the comforting stupidity of dials and meters, than to face the possibility that the first woman to see the curve of Earth did so alone and unrecorded, remembered only by a line of pencil on a log and the static that followed her down. The archive in Turin grew heavy with acetate, cardboard boxes filled with labeled reels, heartbeat, breath, telemetry unknown, until the bunker smelled of warm dust and ferric oxide. The brothers took their evidence to lecture halls, where students leaned forward in the dark as if proximity might thin the static. The tapes played, a metronomic thud like a pulse counted by machine, a ragged inhalation, a Morse string that began as discipline and ended as drifting dots. The room remained very still, suspended between skepticism and pity. Letters arrived like drift bottles. Widows wrote of husbands who had vanished from city rosters when their work went east. Engineers hinted at trials wrapped in military paper. Radio clubs from Hamburg to Leeds sent transcripts of nights when their own antennas had caught something that made conversation stop. A few correspondents enclosed strips of magnetic tape folded into envelopes like relics. Played in the bunker, some were mere atmospheric wanderings. Others landed on the log with times that matched the Turin reels to within a breath. Each account had the same strange modesty, no certainty, only a feeling that a human had been adjacent to their lives for a minute and then gone. In those years, the space race made spectacle, ticker tape, broadcast fanfares, portraits in hero light. But in the headphone worlds beneath that glare, another liturgy formed. A tenderness for strangers whose names might never be spoken. A technician from Bologna wrote that he had begun to leave a chair empty by his receiver at night. For the traveler, he said. It was not quite belief and not quite doubt. It was the patience of listening to the void and admitting that sometimes the void replies, briefly in a voice that sounds like our own. And when the tapes ended, halls stayed quiet a moment longer than polite, as if the audience were waiting for a final breath that never came. Time dulled the headlines, but not the reels. By mid-decade, the brothers were older, their bunker tidier, the antenna masts guyed against alpine winds. The world's gaze had swung to lunar trajectories, to rendezvous and docking, to EVR suits that looked like articulated armor. In that brighter theater, the Turin tapes seemed like backstage noises. Interesting, inconvenient, not quite respectable. Historians and skeptics performed their work. They compared frequencies against published satellite schedules, identified known beacons that could masquerade as heartbeats, and reconstructed how tropospheric ducting might carry a ground transmission hundreds of miles. They found errors in logs, gaps in notebooks, moments when excitement outpaced discipline. They also found, stubbornly present, a handful of nights that would not align. From within the Soviet program, retirees spoke carefully in later decades. Accidents had happened, prototypes had failed, heroic narratives were assembled after the fact and soldered over seams. Dogs died. Pilots were thrown clear of test craft at altitudes where oxygen is a rumor. Was there a human lost in orbit before the world was ready for his name? The men did not say yes. They did not say no. They smoked and paused and let their silences agree with no one. The bunker reels kept turning for visitors who asked. The brothers learned to shrug at labels, hoaxers to some, witnesses to others. They cared most about what the tapes did to a room, how shoulders lowered, how people listened with their whole bodies. In an age of declarations, the reels provided an older instrument, doubt tuned finely enough to hear a heartbeat where certainty insists there is none. On certain winter evenings, when the ionosphere grew glassy and radios came alive like aquariums of light, the brothers still took turns at the headphones. Notebooks open. Nothing arrived most nights. But sometimes a carrier would lift out of the noise with the steadiness of a lifted chin. And for a few breaths, the room felt as it had in 1961, crowded by possibility. Today the tapes live on as copies of copies, their hiss as familiar as the rumors that trail them. Documentaries sample a few haunted seconds. Message boards argue over spectrograms. Archives label the boxes with neutral phrases that mean everything and nothing. Official history remains unchanged. Gagarin flew first, and the age of humans in space began with a safe landing and a smile. Perhaps that is mercy. Stories need clean doors in and out, but the reels propose a different threshold to consider. What if the first human sounds from orbit were not a cheer, not a speech, but breath and counting in the carefully flattened voice of a pilot holding panic at bay? What if the space race, like so many races, began with runners who do not appear on the podium? We will not know until locked files are opened or never, which is the more likely history of secrets. Meanwhile, the sky above Turin looks as it did in 1961. On cold nights, the constellations sharpen until the antenna wires seem to hum by sympathy. Somewhere a satellite glides with the indifferent grace of a clock hand. The brothers are old now. Their bunker is a museum of knobs and patience. Visitors lean toward glass cases that hold reels labeled in tidy pencil. If you stand very still, you can almost hear it. A thin voice crossing the room, not to be understood, only to be remembered. It fades the way all signals do, into noise, which is another word for time. And if the voice never existed, if it was error spooled into myth, that too is a kind of orbit, a story circling the Earth, returning every few years to pass overhead, bright for a minute, then gone. We look up, we listen, and in the act of listening we confess something about ourselves, that we expect pioneers to pay a price, and we fear that the receipt is filed where no one can read it. The night accepts the confession, tucks it among the stars, and keeps on turning.